Today's agenda, I'd like to tell you a bit about the specific research context of this particular project, our research questions, tell you just a small bit about our methods and our participants, and then move more squarely into the discussion of ethics, which I think is much more interesting. So while I'll be providing you with actual data, empirical data from a study, I'd also like to augment that with some ongoing work in the field of philosophy and technology. And then we'll come down to some of our results, results, discussion, and future research. So this project is funded by the National Science Foundation, so thank you to the NSF, and again, thank you to the university, especially the Vice Chancellor, and especially the Dean and the School of Computer and Information Sciences, the faculty and the students. Okay, the faculty and the students have just been fantastic, so thank you. It's okay? All right. Okay, so the context of this research, this was, as I said, NSF funded, a multi-site, 4 institutions, a collaborative research project. One of the trends that we're seeing in research in the US is the importance of collaborative research. Research taking place in silos and isolation, we need to be looking at research in collaborative environments. That's what the world has become. We are very collaborative in our work, in our research, in our computing, and so our research should be collaborative. So we approached this from 4 institutions, and we partnered with the computer science departments, the information communication technology departments, in some cases communications, depending on what particular university, what they were doing with computer ethics and information ethics. So our main inquiry was around graduate education. So I'm particularly happy that I get to speak here at Hyderabad, where your focus is on graduate education. In the United States currently, and through some of Europe, computer science, ICT, ethics education is somewhat common at the undergraduate level. Oftentimes, undergraduates will have 1 or 2 courses, or they'll have some exposure to ethics during their undergraduate careers. However, the same is not true at the graduate level. And what we're seeing is accrediting agencies such as ABET, I understand many of you know ABET, some professional societies like ACM, Association for Computing Machinery, and IEEE are requiring undergraduates to have exposure to ethics. Some get to a very detailed point. They want 8 hours of ethics education, for example. Whereas other institutions, if you're not going through accreditation, you may say, we don't need any ethics. But the trend is for undergraduates to have some form of ethics education. At my institution, our undergraduates take what's called a general education course, and one of the general education courses is an ICT ethics course, which is very, very popular among the students. So as we thought about this project, most of our master's degree students, just as here, and I took your term, the MTech students, most of them have very specific career aspirations. You're working towards your master's, you're working towards a specific vocation. Now, with that, there's a combined element of wanting to do the right thing, wanting to have some form of ethics, but the formal education is not quite there. Awareness, I think, across cultures, one of the great things about talking about ethics is, as I go to different cultures, we talk about ethics in somewhat different ways. But across the board, as I've given lectures across the country, across the world, this desire to have some awareness of professional ethics is a standard, is a norm. We had some meta questions, some larger questions that were bothering us. My research team included myself as a philosopher and 3 computer science instructors. And one of the things that has pulled at the field of computer and information science ethics for many, many years is, well, who should teach this? Who's going to teach ethics? Because I certainly, as a philosopher, can't teach algorithms and can't teach computer science. That's not what I'm trained in. Just like you, as computer scientists, most of you, are not trained to teach ethics. and yet we're getting these requirements. We're hearing from the accrediting agencies, we're hearing from the professional bodies that they want us to be teaching it. So this is a very, very challenging question. How do institutions solve this particular problem of teaching philosophical materials, ethics in particular, to our technical students? And that's a very, very challenging topic, something we've looked at in the literature. There are various pedagogical approaches, and I'll talk about some of those later on. And then finally, as we conceptualize this project, we really are thinking about the pipeline from education into industry, into the workplace. And we were very, very curious, why do we have this divide? We seamlessly move from education to industry with our technical skills, but what's happening with ethics? What does the industry, what does the workplace want us as educators to teach our students about ethics? What do they want our students to know coming into the field? How do they miraculously become ethical workers? So those were our larger questions. So this is just a couple of photos. So this is the University of Wisconsin-Stout, where I come from. This is the University of Illinois, Springfield, University of Maryland, and this is the City University of New York, Brooklyn College. These were our specific research questions. I won't read through all of them. We came at this through the lens of pedagogy. What do we teach? How do we teach? How do students learn? What is appropriate course content? And again, that larger question of who should teach this and how. So these were our underlying research questions, and we worked through this is a 3-year project now, and we're just finishing up some data analysis. But basically, we engaged in qualitative and quantitative data collection using surveys, focus groups, and content analysis. So a pretty straightforward social science approach, actually. We used descriptive and inferential statistics and qualitative coding in our analysis. Our response rate, 33%. Everybody struggles with response rate to surveys. We did get a lot of qualitative data from our field visits and from our focus groups and our content analysis. So we were happy with a 33% response rate. We had 924 students from 4 institutions and 167 faculty from 4 institutions. Our industry response, we thought we would have just tremendous response from industry, that they would be very wanting to tell us about their concerns with ethics, and that wasn't exactly the case. We ended up with only about 30 to 33 participants from IEEE and ACM special interest groups. So we targeted the special interest groups that have to do with social aspects of computing, ethics, etc., thinking that they would give us much richer data. And unfortunately, we just did get a small response rate. So for that purpose, the data that I'm reporting is non-significant from a statistical point of view, but we did rely on the qualitative data. So let me contextualize this. Some of you, I'll ask a question now. How many of you have taken ethics courses? Okay, a couple hands, maybe 3 or 4 out of the room. Okay, not too many. Okay, so that's, again, that's the norm. So let me contextualize ethics, define ethics for you. Ethics comes from the Latin term ethos, which means customs, habitual conduct, usages, and character. When we talk about ethics, we're talking about morals, moral systems. We're talking about human conduct. Okay, this is okay. We're talking about concepts, and I put these in quotes: right and wrong, good and bad. Those are terms that obviously have a lot of context dependency. They have a lot of cultural dependency and generational dependency, or temporal dependency. We think about something that we considered right 50 years ago that may not be considered right today. So those terms are very fluid. What ethics seeks to do is to systematically understand and define those concepts. So by looking at a particular concept, a particular issue that we label good or bad. We look at it within context. So for computing professionals, we look at a particular issue in computer ethics and discuss it from a professional point of view, societal point of view, cultural point of view, etc. Ethics examines concepts and constructs such as responsibility and rights. This brings us squarely into the realm of professional ethics. As professionals, we assume certain responsibilities and we gain certain rights. And that's a critical piece of professional ethics education, ensuring that our students understand what their responsibilities are and what their rights are as professionals. There's a line oftentimes, and I don't know if it applies here in India from conversations I've had the last couple of weeks, but oftentimes we see a line between one's personal ethics and one's professional ethics. And that's a challenging line. One does not want to have significant differences between their personal ethics and their professional ethics. If you felt very, very strongly about something going on in your workplace that you personally didn't agree with, you're going to have a very difficult time being a responsible worker that wants to be there. So as I've listened to many people throughout my couple of weeks here, I'm not sure that line is quite as thick as it is in some other cultures. So that line, again, between professional and personal ethics. So when we asked our students, I remember we had about 900 some students. These were all master's level students at 4 institutions. The main things that we heard from them were ethics is doing the right thing. It's about morality, common good, and religion. We were a bit surprised that we got religion as an answer. In the philosophical discourse, ethics and religion are not the same thing. And but this did pop up as one of the most commonly coded responses. With ethics, and as we make ethical decisions, there are some conditions that must be met. We must be free. In order to make ethical decisions, we must be free, meaning we are not incarcerated, we're not being coerced, we're not being held against our will in some way, shape, or form. Ethics requires that freedom. Ethics also requires that we want to do what is right. Now that assumes a certain cultural conditions, that assumes certain temporal conditions, but ultimately we want to do the right thing, we as human beings. And then finally, that we can make conscious, thoughtful, and reflective decisions. This is an important piece. And what we're seeing in our world today is everything moves at a very, very fast speed. Our technologies are continually moving faster and faster. It's harder for the philosophers or those that are charged with thinking about the societal impacts of a given technology, because just as we're in this reflective mode, this thoughtful and reflective mode, the technologies continue to change and morph and develop and become faster and faster and do things that we are still struggling to understand from a policy perspective. So this is important and yet a very, very challenging condition to meet in the everyday workplace. And then finally, with ethics, we have 3 types of ethical thinking. And I bring this out today just so you have that framework. Those of you who haven't taken ethics, you do this every day. You engage in ethical thinking and ethical decision-making every day. You may just not have the language for it. So anytime you report a fact, so writing bad code is unethical. Okay, that we could say that. We could just make a statement. We could say writing bad code is normal, right? So we're just making a statement. We're not saying necessarily that it's good or bad until we get into normative ethics, and then finally at prescriptive ethics. So ultimately, all of us function at this level of descriptive ethics every day. We're always making decisions. Oh, I hate Facebook's new privacy policy. Okay, we're not saying that it's good or bad. We're simply making a statement about it. when we move into the further two realms, normative and prescriptive, that's where we do start making our ethical judgments. We're concerned with what ought to be the case. And particularly at the level of prescriptive ethical statements, we want to be able to generalize those statements. So again, think about that Facebook example. So if we say Facebook's privacy policy hurts individual autonomy, okay, we're making a statement. Then we're going to move it down to Facebook's privacy policy should be changed to, and then finish the statement with an ought. So it ought to be more respectful of individual autonomy. So we're moving down. What we want by the time we reach prescriptive ethics is that it applies to all of us. It's not just dependent on me. It's not just about me. It's about all of us. We would want the same for our colleagues, for our friends, for our family, for the rest of our community. So we want to be able to generalize. So with that little bit of context, let's move into what are the core ethical issues in computing. So dating back to the mid-1980s, the computer philosopher James Moore talked about computer ethics in a very foundational, seminal article entitled, "What is Computer Ethics?" To this day, it's still looked at as one of the most important pieces of literature that we have in this field. In it, he laid out a number of qualities or characteristics of computer information, computer data, if you will. And he talked about computer data as being greased and malleable, meaning that it can flow very, very quickly from one place to another. Now again, think this is 1980s. We're not talking about today's ubiquitous computing environment, but still he was seeing how data had that ability to move very quickly from one place to another, from point A to point Z. He talked about it being malleable, meaning that you can take data and morph it from one situation into another very, very easily. And think about what we do today with data mining and data matching. That's exactly what we're talking about with data being malleable. Okay? So because of those two primary conditions, Moore suggested that we simply haven't had the policy, the legal frameworks, the policy frameworks, or even the social frameworks to understand how to respond. What kinds of legislation should we have? What kinds of ethics should we have around this new form of data? So he talked about this environment then that we end up in called a policy vacuum. So the policy vacuum means we don't know. We don't know how to make appropriate policy decisions, legislation, rules, etc. And this is at the macro level down to the micro level at individual workplaces, individual institutions, and so forth. So, and I say we're still experiencing this today. In the United States context, for example, the FTC is charged with kind of governing the internet. They're kind of the police of the internet. Well, there's I don't know how many actual workers are at FTC, but I can tell you there's a lot more people on the internet than are workers at the FTC. And so there's a constant challenge to keep up. FTC cannot police the internet. So what are some of the things, though, that, for example, FTC would want to govern? Okay, what are the core ethical issues that we've seen really from the beginning of networked computing in particular? The main thing that was reported by our students and our faculty, the number one ethical concern, is the collection and storage of personal data. Now, I find this personally very interesting, given that it's typically ourselves that's sharing these data. Typically, we're putting the data out there for convenience. Where's my recommender system friend that I met earlier this morning somewhere in the audience? We talked about recommender systems, and we talked about the fact that, well, of course I'll give up some of my personal privacy for convenience and for recommendations. So there's that trade-off. But nevertheless, we're still reporting this as our number one concern from our population. The second, interrelated, of course, is privacy, this overall concept of privacy. Privacy is a very difficult concept to define. It's bound by culture, it's bound by time, it's bound by societal norms, etc. So privacy, when we talk about it in one context, it may not map over into another context very easily. I don't know enough yet about India to know exactly what the privacy norms are here, but I think it's something to be thinking about. The next reported is ownership. So our students and our faculty are very concerned about issues of ownership, meaning intellectual property rights, copyright, patents, licensing, and so forth, and access to information ranked fourth. I mentioned today at lunch, I find it interesting that India is watching this case about access to information around this new book called The Hindus, if anyone has saw that on the front page of the newspaper the last couple of days. So that's a key access to information case, and I'll talk about cases in just a minute. And then finally, plagiarism and licensing. Plagiarism, again, our students reported this, and there are some very interesting qualitative comments that were given that students feel that when others cheat, that they're being cheated as well. So students are very, very aware of plagiarism. Now, again, I will say it again, that plagiarism also has cultural contexts, and in some cultures, plagiarism is not considered offensive, but in fact it's considered a gift. It's considered respect. So when we talk about all of these issues in a global environment, they're not cut and dry. They're not easy to define, and we always have to look at the broader context and look at the micro and macro levels that are impacting these things. So these are some of the core issues. And this comes from a student. I thought this was a wonderful quote. So we asked, what are the key ethical issues or core ethical issues facing you? And we can read this together. So a student said, sheesh, there are a lot. GPS tracking to see if employees are doing what they are supposed to be doing. Senior management in certain types of production-oriented organizations drilling down and watching communication of employees. So we have that privacy, that surveillance piece there. All financial information being available to those who hold the keys to the kingdom. So the people who are running our net databases, sysadmins, they have the keys to the kingdom. The idea of due diligence and knowing what to do if there is a problem. That's part of ethical decision making. The ease of copying and retransmitting information. Again, this is a student saying this, and he or she was talking specifically right at what Moore had said. It's greased, it's malleable. Look at how data moves and who has access to it. It is possible that pretty much every single person going through it could be computer science or ICT program at X institution, has likely stolen music or digital content to some degree or another in the past. And that's an interesting concept there, to some degree. So anecdotally, I've asked students, have you illegally downloaded? Everybody says yes. And I say, well, would you steal from a store? Oh, no. And I say, well, what's the difference? Why do you feel so differently? And so that gap, that absence, that lack of physical presence definitely plays into our minds when we're thinking about a tangible product and taking something versus something that it doesn't matter if I take it because a million other people can still have it. Whereas if I take that physical product, that physical thing, no one else can have it. So there's a psychological distance that occurs when we think about digital data versus our tangible, our physical data. So we're seeing that. Okay, so now let's think about some of the really interesting, I think, really interesting issues that are facing us in the fields of computer science, information science, cognitive science, etc. Now, there's some great research going on in these areas, but ethics is a part of it, I will say that. However, it's the challenge of keeping up. So in the fields of pattern recognition and multimedia systems, these were reported from our faculty. These were programs and areas where they saw core ethical issues. coming out. So in human-computer interaction. So how much agency do we give over to our computers? Where is the line between human and computer? We're seeing that play out in the fields of artificial intelligence. This field of participatory sensing, we talked about that a bit yesterday. And how far do we go? How far can we go? We know that our technologies are kind of invincible, right? They can go as far as we push them. So we, the humans, we're still in charge, we think. However, we're slowly letting go. We're slowly letting go by virtue of participating in our technologies, putting our technologies in our bodies, allowing our technologies to control us. The talk I gave last week in Bhubaneswar, I talked about the fact that in maybe, not even 10 years ago, we used to have to connect to things. We used to have to do something to get connected to our networks, to our friends, to our devices. Now they are surrounding us. They're ubiquitous. They're pervasive. So the technologies are there, and we, the humans, are the objects in many ways. So we're seeing this in the very, very fascinating fields of artificial intelligence, participatory sensing, and data mining, of course, where we're giving up. We as humans are giving up agency, autonomy by virtue of our data. So that line between the human and our data is increasingly shrinking. Some additional ethical concerns are arising in these fields of cognitive enhancement, particularly in the forms of these smart pills that we can take, brain implants. Now, as any philosopher of technology will tell you, this is not black and white, and we don't always just say, look at the negative. Of course, when we talk about brain implants and smart pills, these can be used to positive ends, and I certainly don't want to present myself as saying we don't want to use these towards progress, medical progress, scientific progress. However, we do want to think about the broader societal aspects of these technologies. So what does it mean when we systematically accept brain implants, brain enhancements, neuroimaging? So we can tell if someone is lying. We can tell what someone's thinking. We're using these techniques, right? We're using them in military defense operations all the time. These are not new per se, but the uses are becoming much more typical. And the uses of these kinds of technologies, enhancements and neuroimaging, ubiquitous surveillance, those are becoming the normals. We're not questioning their roles as actively as we were even 10 years ago. Again, it's the idea that ubiquitous, pervasive computing surrounds us. And it's very interesting, right? And it's fun. I have to say, I've been here in the guest house, and for whatever reason, I can't get wireless in my room, so I have to go outside to the balcony. And to not have this sense of ubiquity is somewhat frightening for me, because you get so used to having it, and then when you don't have it, it feels like something's been taken away from you. So I encourage us as individuals, and I've done this with my students, doesn't go over very well, ask them to not go on Facebook for a day, 2 days, 3 days, to not use technology, and I let them define that, not use technology for a week. What do you think happens? By about 3 hours in, I'm getting emails, calls, texts, tweets. I can't do this, right? And I experienced this while I've been here. So this idea of ubiquitous computing is the normal, and we are part of it. And it's positive in the sense of security. It's positive in the sense that we are interconnected, that I can still keep in touch with my children even though I'm on the other side of the world. So that sense of ubiquity is powerful. What does happen that I am very profoundly concerned with in the face of ubiquitous computing and surveillance is the idea of non-consensual access to data, meaning that data are being collected all the time. And many of you are probably writing these programs while I'm talking up here, right? Many of you are working on these programs, right? That mine data, that I don't even know if you're collecting my data. An example that I came across recently, on the new iPhone, there's a pedometer, it keeps track of how far you walk each day. Well, it was there. I had to just put the little icon so I could actually see how far I've walked each day, but the data were being collected anyway. So there is an element, and that's a silly example, that's a trivial example, but data are continually being mined, collected, stored, and correlated. And that's the piece that we want to be very careful when we talk about this non-consensual access to data. Obviously, we're in this realm then of talking about our privacy, our autonomy, our agency. These are at the core of those things. So societally and individually and professionally, we're making decisions about this non-consensual access to data. And it takes different shapes in different cultures, different contexts. Some of us are very willing to give up our data for nothing. Some of us are saying, well, why are you Facebook making all the money and I'm not getting anything back? But do we charge Facebook? We don't have to pay anything for it, right? So that's the trade-off. So, okay, so those are some of the emerging ethical issues that we're looking at in information computer science right now. So I want to just give you some snippets of findings from our particular study about pedagogy in particular. So as we think about the second half of the talk, we're thinking about pedagogy. So approximately 70% of our respondents, combined faculty and students, supported the idea of elective ethics coursework. So only 30% wanted it required. People are willing to take it as long as they're not forced to take it. It's okay, it's as long as I have a choice. So 70% supporting elective. What we saw play out with our faculty and our students, the majority use case studies and current events and role-playing as the most common forms of pedagogical approach to ethics in the classroom. And I think, I use the example of the book, The Hindus, today. And I think that, we just open our newspaper and we find cases, we find examples every day. So and coming back around to that question of who teaches this stuff, how do we teach it, how this is so difficult, it's not. It's not at all. Even the most hardcore computer scientists can look at the newspaper and say, now wait a second, this relates to something I'm doing in the classroom. Even if it takes 30 seconds out of the class, using something from current events, a case study can make a big difference. Now, we're trying to figure this one out. We have some data that we're still trying to understand here. Of our respondents, male students, and of course we had more male respondents than female respondents in both our faculty and our students, but statistically, male students and faculty more frequently reported that they understood ethics. So the female students and faculty didn't report the confidence that we saw with our male participants saying, yes, I know what ethics is, and I feel prepared to deal with it. So there's a gendered issue there that, again, we're still trying to sort out through our qualitative data because these were not statistically significant. But men, you tend to feel that you know how to respond to ethical challenges more confidently than women. What we also found was that the role of undergraduate education, and you'll remember I said in many U.S. institutions, undergraduate ethics is required in some way, shape, or form. So this particular area that is statistically correlated with the belief that I understand what information computer ethics is, and the belief that I'm prepared for ethical challenges in my profession when I graduate. So those students who had undergraduate ethics education understood it more and felt more confident going into a professional career. It makes sense, okay? But we do like to see that that is statistically correlated, significantly correlated. What we didn't see is any kind of correlation with the role of professional societies, which we really, coming into our research, we thought the professional societies would be more important. And I don't know the context here, but in the US, the professional societies are typically not joined by students unless they have to for a class, unless they get a discount to go to a conference. Then they'll join for a year and then drop. But the role of the professional societies is not robust at this point in time. And it could be. One of the areas that we picked up on is that mentoring is critical. Mentoring is critical for our graduate students, our postdocs, and our new employees, our new workers in industry. And yet mentoring is not necessarily taking place in the professional societies. So something to think about in the future. Okay, so of our very small pool of industry responses, there's some interesting data. 67% of our respondents, so about two-thirds of respondents had ethics content in academia, most of which came from class discussions. So again, using things like case studies and role-playing in the classroom or with discussion. 63% received no ethics training on the job. Okay, so we're sending our students into the job, into the workplace, into industry, and they're not receiving ethics training once they get there. Most new employees receive no ethics training, but our respondents are at 84% think that new employees should receive ethics training. So we're getting a lot of these shoulds. We're getting, yeah, we should do this, we should do that, and yet who's doing it? We haven't yet gotten there. So we should be getting new employee training. And we had, even though the population was small, we had some really interesting places from which, and a couple actually from India in our response pool. So Tata Consultancy and Electronics Corporation of India and so forth. So this is here. I mean, maybe someone in this room responded to my survey. But you're anonymous, so we won't ask for you to raise your hand. I respect your anonymity. Okay, so here's some, the text might be a little small for you in the back. These are just some qualitative comments that came from our industry respondents. So why should our new employees receive ethics training? Well, there are a variety of reasons. Ethics are, or at least should be, an integral part, and this is in a campus environment. Generally, we hire new bachelors of science and electrical engineering, would that be, graduates who are young, honest, and relatively naive. They are very likely to express concern about perceived ethical violations. It's important for engineers to understand our obligations to society. I'm very happy with this response that ethics is required for informed decision making. To me, that's key. Another respondent, it shouldn't necessarily be labeled as ethics. So maybe, you know, and I understand that. So I'm an ethicist on my campus, and typically when people know I'll be coming to a meeting or giving a talk, they think I'm going to tell them all the things that they're doing bad or all the things that they can't do. And that's not what ethics is. That's compliance. Ethics and compliance are very, very different. But people hear ethics and they think, oh boy, uh-oh, what did I do wrong? So this person picked up on that, and it shouldn't be labeled as ethics, so we can think about legislation and so forth. Thinking about how to understand and manage data, interviews, etc. And I think this, again, is a very nice comment. Have to respect their colleagues and work in pedagogic and research teams, respect intellectual property, and be honest. So these are not hard principles, right? These are not anything that we need to work very, very hard on with our students and with ourselves. Many of these are things that we do every day. So the challenge is spinning them to these more complex issues that we face in our work. Some of the challenges. So what are some of our industry folks saying? What's going on out there? What ethical challenges? So we've had potential employers try to recruit me to unethical behaviors. I've had to make ethical choices about when to release software. So again, a simple thing, releasing software, what are the ethics in that? But there are ethics involved in it. I've had ethical challenges with respect to student cheating. There are many topics. What to research and what to present. That's an ethical issue. When we, at the conference last week in Bhubaneswar, it's an ethical decision what results to present for the computer scientists in the room, what code to share, how much do you want to share? At what point are you ready to share your data? At what point do you open it up? Okay, those are ethical issues. Here's this idea of malleability, taking digital images for one purpose, using them for another. This happens all the time, right? We see this more and more with Flickr and Facebook and the merging of our social media tools. It's very easy to manipulate images. And in the research integrity data, we see that image manipulation is the most reported offense in research integrity. So if you get funding in the US in particular, if you get research funding from the National Institutes of Health or National Science Foundation, what happens is you get reported. If your data gets found to be manipulated, fabricated, falsified in any way, image manipulation, you will get reported. Also, this unwillingness to share knowledge, guidance, a professional hypocrisy, one respondent said, hype of striving for imposing a superiority, lack of devotion with the organization's goals. So lack of devotion with the organization's goals comes down to that professional, personal divide. So do you have devotion to your workplace? And if you don't, why? You would want to really think about, what does that mean if I have fundamental issues with my work? Okay, and then finally plagiarism and copyright. Just a few others. This talks about superiors having upper management. Sometimes there's the feeling that our upper management doesn't follow the rules, but we are supposed to. So that came out in our data. We see issues around antitrust, business goals, and my technical opinion. So I think this one here, as our students leave us and go into the industry, we are doing the best training we can, giving them wonderful skills, technical skills, but there may be conflicts once they get into the workplace. We teach them one way, and business wants them to do it another way. A simple example of that is with group work. So I see it here. I've been in the labs, and I've seen many of the students working together, and that's really positive. In what we see in the US is a problem with group work, because we, the instructors, then say, well, who gets the credit? How do we grade for this? And that's a key issue. We have to give you a grade. So we want to make sure it's fair. And we send you into industry expecting you to have group skills. So we need to make sure you have the group skills from our classes. So as instructors, as faculty, something for you to think about: how are you engaging group work, and how are you evaluating group work? There are two very different things, and when I work with our computer science students at Stout, one of the things we talk about is the different standards. So in academia, the standard is that you do your work, you participate, you collaborate, you share in your responses, but ultimately you are responsible for your own grade, okay? And that can be done through peer review, it can be done through a number of assessment measures. However, in industry, if you don't participate actively, if you don't collaborate as a good collaborator, you're not a good citizen in your research team, on your research team, in your research group, you'll get fired. right? It's very different. As a student, might get a C or fail the class, but in the real world, you get fired. So we need to teach those skills of group work, collaboration, partnership, and respect for others in this global environment. Okay, so some recommendations, and we'll have time. I think we're still okay. So why should we be teaching computer science ethics? Okay, well, I've mentioned a number of reasons throughout today. One of which is accreditation standards. Okay, if our programs are accredited, again, it could be ABET or any other accrediting agency. Our accrediting agencies are now starting to look for that piece of ethics. So that's why we might want to start including it. It's a very pro forma response, okay? They're telling us to do it, so we do it. But I think more importantly, what we're seeing is this integral role of computer science, information communication technology across all disciplines, across our world. Very few of us, what is it now, 1 in 6 is on Facebook, and just about everywhere you go, you can get a cell signal. There are not too many places you can go where you can't be found. So we have the opportunity to engage our students and our future professionals in this growing and changing world, and with the changing technologies, introducing these ethical aspects. We do have to address generational and cultural differences. This is a topic that's been discussed in the literature for years and years, and we still don't really have an answer. Culture is complex. Any sociologists in the room will tell you that, right? Anthropologists. We've been trying to study culture forever and understand it. Well, it's no different when we talk about computer ethics. Okay, there's generational difference, cultural difference. So the importance of context. Context is critical. Now, context gets more challenging in this environment, though, right? We have multinational teams. We have research projects, trans-border research projects. So our contexts are multiplicitous, right? Our contexts are shifting. Here in India, you have, I forget how many states here in India. And what I'm learning is, from one state to another, there's very significant cultural difference, right? Right? So, well, but what our industry does expect, industry workers, wants workers with integrity. And as we looked through our qualitative data, what became very, very clear is they don't necessarily care if we teach, Aristotle or Kant or Buddhism. They don't care how we teach ethics. They don't care what means it is. But the end goal is to have people with integrity and an awareness of these professional ethics issues. So the technical piece, that we can always teach more and more technical skills, but a grounding in ethics, meaning how we relate to others, our conduct, our customs, etc., all those things I talked about early on, those are what we need to be teaching and talking about. So it's not so much about ethics, book smarts. You don't need to read philosophy in your classes, don't worry. But real-world decision-making skills. That's what's critical. Okay, so you've accepted that you have to do this. Either an accrediting agency told you have to do it, or you've been enlightened and you decided you want to do this. So ethics education has 5 tenets that we like to follow. And any kind of ethics education, regardless of discipline, not just computer science or ICT, these are the things that we'd want to see, that students' moral imaginations are stimulated. Talk about what are the ethical consequences of releasing software too early, or of releasing, if you're in security, releasing a worm in the wild. What are the ethical implications of those things? Not just the technical, but the ethical, the societal. We are to help people recognize moral issues, just as goes along with that moral imagination. Things that we think of as purely technical, we can find that ethical piece to it. We need to be teaching how to analyze and apply concepts and principles. So this is through logic. The computer scientists and mathematicians in the room, you've all had plenty of logic in your time. So teaching how to analyze and apply, this is pretty much straight logic. Encouraging responsibility, and that should be professional, civic, societal, professional. So talking about things like joining a professional society. What are the benefits to that? Or doing volunteer work for a civic group or for a school. Those are things we want to instill. And then finally, and this is the most critical, is teaching people to understand, respect, and reason about ethical disagreements or uncertainty in this multicultural, global environment. We will always have these differences, right? We don't want one world with one norm. We don't want that. That would be very boring. But we have to accept. This is we are shrinking in some ways, or some call it the world is getting flatter. I had Domino's pizza last night here in Hyderabad, so that should tell that the world is getting flatter. But how do we want to make sure we are doing this every day in our classrooms, and bringing outsiders like me in. That's one way of doing it. Your institution reached out to me to come and talk about this. That's a positive step. So when we talk about assessment measures, I mentioned case studies before. One of the things, though, people always make this mistake when we do case studies, is we always get those front page news articles. We always think those are the ones that are the most interesting. And they are. However, those are also, they're the most easy. They're the easiest to decide and answer to, right? They're not subtle. So the one on the paper today about censorship, you're either pro-censorship or you're not. You're either for or against it. There's not a lot of gray in that particular case. But if you take something much more subtle, it takes a lot more of these skills to sort through. So should you decide to use case studies, look beyond the first page of the paper. Go to the fourth, fifth. Look for the little reports about, data, a breach in security. Target in America lost millions of personal credit cards not too long, right around the holiday season. Look for those kinds of things. What are the ethical issues there? This integration of workplace into classroom, I think many of you are doing this from my time here. I've seen it, so I won't say too much about it. But what you can encourage is, as additional work for your students, have them interview compliance officers. I don't think you're going to find too many ethics officers in your IT companies here. We're just starting to see ethics officers. And again, ethics officers are very different from compliance officers. Compliance is about following a strict standard, a rule, a law. You're either doing it or you're not. Ethics is not so much that. So combining a technical assignment with an ethical component, we've talked about that. And then finally, this element of group work. I'll mention that just one more time. So consider alternative grading practices for your group work projects. Okay. And then finally, how many of you are familiar with the Computer Society of India? Okay, are any of you members? One, two, a couple. Are you not willing to tell me this? Okay. Well, do you all know then that you have a code of ethics? Those of you that raised your hand, how many of you knew that you have a code of ethics as part of this? Okay, a couple of you. Have either of you signed it? Because this one, you affirm your agreement with this. Now, what's very interesting about this particular code of ethics is that it actually has a punishment if there's a breach. Now, a lot of codes of ethics do not go this far. They do all the nice things, and they tell you, here's what we want of you. And then they stop, and they don't tell you, well, what if you catch someone? What if your colleague is doing something bad or wrong or unethical? What do you do then? Most of us, that's the problem. The challenge has been and remains to be enforcement, you know. And again, that's the compliance piece. So what if something doesn't fall into the compliance realm? What if it is more about customs or habits, of habitual conduct, things like that? So the challenge is enforcement. So if you sign this, right, if you sign it and then violate an ethical principle, you can get kicked out of the society, right? And it's published. It's published what you did and that you are no longer a member in good standing. So there's reputation here. But look at how many of you are involved in this or buy into this. And it's the same when I do this lecture in the US. You know, a couple hands are members of ACM. How many know the Code of Ethics, and a couple more. But until we all decide we want this, then it's paper. It's not much more. Is there a global computer science ethics? Well, maybe. There's something called the 10 Commandments of Computer Ethics. Sounds a little Christian, I guess, but the 10 Commandments of Computer Ethics talks about not using a computer to harm others, respecting others. It has 10 things. I don't know if we can hyperlink to it or not, but it's something to think about. There are 10 principles, and maybe they truly can cross cultures and borders. But even if, again, then we'll come down to the enforcement piece. So our future work, we're in the process of running some inferential statistics on areas looking at specifically gender. What is the role of gender and ethics? There's some fascinating work in women's studies and in feminist literature around gender and ethics. So we're looking at that as well as age. So most of our industry respondents were on the older side, whereas most of our students were in their 20s. And so there's a significant gap there in what we see. So we're still looking at some of those crosstabs to see what statistically is different. Oops. For a number of, so we're looking at number of years in industry. How does that impact one's feelings about ethics or beliefs about ethics? And then finally, we'd like to replicate this study in non-US institutions. I teach in Austria, so I did just a small pilot there, and it was not, the data were not very robust. I'll just leave it at that for now.